Beneath a blood moon's crimson gaze, the snow wept scarlet for the forsaken. Arya Thorn staggered through the frozen veil of the whispering peaks, her breath a ragged ghost in the howling wind. The cold clawed at her like the fingers of the pack that had cast her out, each gust a reminder of the betrayal that had stripped her bare. 26 winters had hardened her once soft edges, but nothing could prepare for the raw ache of rejection, the Omega's bond severed not by choice, but by the sharp decree of those she had called kin. Exile was no mere banishment. It was a slow unraveling, thread by thread, until only the wind's lament remained to mourn her. The snow fell in relentless sheets, blanketing the jagged mountains in a shroud of white that muffled the distant wivios of wolves, wild ones perhaps, or echoes of the pack she had lost. Arya's boots sank into the drifts, each step a battle against the numbness creeping up her legs. Her fur-lined cloak, tattered from the flight, offered little against the bite of the north wind, which carried the metallic tang of impending storm. Blood, her own, trickled from a gash on her palm where she had gripped a thorned branch too tightly during her desperate escape. She pressed it to her chest, feeling the erratic thud of her heart beneath the thin wool of her tunic. The wound burned, a small fire in the vast cold, but it was nothing compared to the deeper scar, the one etched not on skin, but in soul. She had been Arya of the Silverfang pack, healer and quiet guardian, her Omega nature a gentle current in the turbulent river of alpha wills. Until Kaelin Moore, that shadowed blade of a man at 37, had led the raid that shattered it all. His orders, whispered in the council fires, had condemned her for a crime she did not commit. Whispers of treason, planted like seeds in fertile soil of suspicion. Arya saw his face, still in the flames of memory. Hard lines carved by duty, eyes like storm clouds, unyielding as he drove the pack's fury upon her kin. Her brother's blood had stained the snow that night, and hers would have followed if she hadn't fled into the wilds. Now, banished to die in the unforgiving embrace of the peaks, she was less than nothing, a ghost haunting her own life. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of pine and smoke, luring her toward a narrow ravine where ancient stones jutted like the ribs of some forgotten beast. Arya paused, her silver hair whipping across her face, matted with frost. The blood moon hung low, its ruddy light painting the snow in hues of bruised flesh, a celestial witness to her solitude. She touched the pendant at her throat, a simple silver crescent, etched with the Deuce's rune, the last gift from her mother before the pack's madness claimed her too. It warmed against her skin, unnaturally so, as if drawing strength from the lunar glow. Was it a curse or a comfort? In the silence, she wondered if the Deusa had turned her face away, leaving only the moon's cold judgment. Hunger gnawed at her belly, a hollow echo of the feasts she once shared by the hearth. She had rationed the last strips of dried venison, but they were gone now, swallowed by the endless march. Visions flickered at the edges of her vision. The great hall of the pack's stronghold, torches flickering on walls of ice-veined stone, the Alpha's voices booming like thunder. And there, in the shadows, Lucen Mar, the Alpha King himself, 40 seasons etched into his noble frame, his presence a quiet storm of restraint. He had watched her trial with eyes like deep forest pools, saying nothing as Kaelin's accusations flew. Love? No, that was a fool's fancy. Lucen was bound by crown and code, his silences heavier than any decree. Yet in her fevered dreams, his gaze had lingered, a unspoken plea she dared not name. A low growl rumbled from the darkness ahead, snapping her from reverie. Arya froze, her hand instinctively reaching for the dagger at her belt, a crude thing, forged from scavenged iron. The ravine narrowed, its walls glistening with hoar-frost under the moon's bloody veil. Shadows stirred, not wolf, but something larger, cloaked in the night's embrace. Her pulse thundered in her ears, drowning the wind's wail. Was this the end, then? Pursuers from the pack come to finish what exile had begun? Or beasts drawn by the scent of her blood spilling fresh into the snow? She backed against a boulder, the stone's chill seeping through her cloak like accusation. The pendant pulsed hotter now, a faint glow tracing its edges, as if the moon itself bled light into her grasp. Arya clenched her fist around it, the gash reopening, warm crimson welling forth. What is strength, she thought in the heartbeat of fear, if not the will to endure when mercy is denied? The growl grew closer, paws crunching the snow, and in that moment, under the blood moon's unblinking eye, Arya Thorne faced the abyss, not as victim, but as survivor, her spirit a fragile flame against the gathering dark. The shadows parted, revealing not one hunter, but a figure stumbling from the mist, broad-shouldered, cloaked in midnight fur, his breath labored like a wounded beast's. He collapsed to his knees mere paces away, blood staining the snow at his feet, not hers, but his own. Arya's instincts warred, flee or aid. The wind howled its warning, but the moon watched, silent and expectant. The figure slumped forward, his cloak parting like ragged wings to reveal a man forged in the fires of forgotten battles, broad of frame, yet bowed by some unseen weight. Blood seeped from a gash across his ribs, dark and viscous against the pale fur, staining the snow in erratic patterns that mirrored the moon's fractured light. Arya's breath caught, a sharp inhale that tasted of iron and pine. She knew that scent, even diluted by the storm. Musk and steel, the mark of an alpha, laced with the bitter edge of desperation. Her dagger hand trembled, instincts screaming flight, but the pendant at her throat burned like a brand, anchoring her to the spot. He lifted his head, and the world narrowed to his eyes, storm-gray, shadowed by pain, locking onto hers with a recognition that twisted like a knife. Kaelin Moore. The name clawed through her mind, unbidden, summoning the ghosts of that bloodied night in the Silverfang Hall. 37 winters had etched lines into his face, a map of commands given and regrets unspoken. But it was him. The blade who had whispered her doom, his voice steady as he accused her of treason before the pack's assembled fury. She had seen him then, unyielding, his hand on the hilt of his sword, as her brother's life ebbed into the frost. Now, here he was, felled like a stag in the wilds, his breath rasping in the frigid air. Fear coiled in her gut, hot and primal, warring with the omega pull that urged her toward the wounded. Why him? Why now, in this forsaken ravine where the wind carved secrets from the stone? Arya's fingers tightened on the dagger, the blade's edge catching the blood moon's glow, turning it to crimson fire. She could end it, slash across that exposed throat, let the snow drink his guilt as it had her kin's. The thought bloomed, seductive in its justice, but curiosity flickered beneath, a traitorous spark. What storm had broken this hunter? Exile's isolation had taught her the fragility of vengeance. It warmed no bones against the cold. Kaelin coughed, a wet sound that sprayed flecks of red onto the drifts, and pushed himself up on one arm. His gaze never wavered, piercing through the veil of her hatred like moonlight through cloud. "You," he rasped, voice gravel rough, laced with surprise that bordered on accusation. "The traitor from Silverfang. What fate twists us here?" Her lips curled in a snarl, the words stinging like salt in her wound. "Traitor? That's the lie you forged, Moore, the one that sent me into this grave." She stepped closer despite herself, the snow crunching under her boots, drawn by the raw vulnerability in his slumped form. Up close, the wound was worse, deep, ragged, as if claws or blade had sought his heart. The scent of his blood mingled with hers, a metallic symphony under the moon's watchful eye, stirring something instinctive, a bond she refused to name, omega to alpha, even across the chasm of betrayal. He winced, pressing a hand to his side, but his eyes held steady, searching her face as if reading runes in the frost on her skin. Fate, or folly, I didn't come for you. The words hung between them, heavy as the gathering sleet, yet they carried no threat, only exhaustion. Arya's pulse thundered, curiosity edging out fear. Who hunted him? The pack's justice turning inward, perhaps, or rivals in the endless games of power that alphas played under the Deusa's indifferent gaze. The wind howled louder, whipping snow into veils that blurred the ravine's edges, and a distant weevo echoed, pursuers, wolves or worse, drawn by the scent of blood. Kaelin's head snapped toward the sound, a low growl rumbling from his chest. Primal and protective despite his state. Arya hesitated, the dagger lowering fractionally. To leave him was mercy to herself, to aid him, a madness born of the moon's cruel whimsy. But the pendant pulsed again, warmer now, as if the Deusa whispered of threads unseen, weaving enemy to exile in the loom of destiny. She knelt, reluctant, the cold biting through her knees as she tore a strip from her cloak's hem. "Don't mistake this for forgiveness," she murmured, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The fabric pressed against his wound, soaking through with his heat, his blood mingling with the dried stain on her palm. His breath hitched at the touch, a spark jumping between them. Instinctive, electric, denied by the wall of old wounds. Arya met his gaze, seeing not the blade of her ruin, but a man cracked by his own choices, guilt flickering in those gray depths like embers in ash. "Why help?" he asked, voice fading as pain claimed him, his hand brushing hers in the snow, unintentional, yet it sent a shiver through her, deeper than the cold. "Because the moon sees no sides," she replied. The words tasting of philosophy forged in solitude. What is redemption, if not the choice to bind what was meant to break? The Uivos grew nearer, shadows stirring in the mist, and Arya pulled him toward the ravine's sheltering overhang, their breaths sinking in the storm's roar. Fear and curiosity twisted into something unnamed, a fragile alliance under the blood moon's gaze, as the night closed in. And now, I invite you to leave a trace of your presence in the comments. Tell us where in the world you're watching from and the exact hour you hear this story. We wish to know how far these northern confessions travel, and at what moments of the night they find you. The ravine swallowed them whole, its jagged walls a fortress of ice and shadow under the blood moon's unrelenting stare. Arya dragged Kaelin deeper into the overhang, his weight a dead burden against her side, his blood soaking through her makeshift bandage to warm her chilled skin like an unwelcome ember. The Weavos pierced the storm now, sharp and coordinated, not the wild cries of beasts, but the disciplined howls of hunters, their echoes bouncing off the stone like accusations. She shoved him against the frozen earth, piling snow-dusted boulders to barricade the narrow entrance, her hands raw and trembling from the effort. The air grew thick with the scent of pine resin and fierce sweat, mingling with the copper tang of their shared wounds, a reminder that survival demanded no allegiances, only cunning. Kaelin's breath came in shallow rasps, his gray eyes half-lidded but alert, tracking her movements with a mix of wariness and something softer, unnameable. He tried to rise, muscles coiling like a spring, but pain buckled him back, a low groan escaping his lips. "Leave me," he muttered, voice frayed as old rope. "They hunt me, not you. The pack's shadows, rivals who whisper of my failures." His words hung in the dimness, illuminated only by the faint crimson glow filtering through cracks in the stone, casting his face in hellish relief. Failures. The word stirred the ashes of her own ruin, the night he had stood tall in the hall, his testimony sealing her fate. Yet here, in this burrow of earth and frost, he seemed diminished, the blade dulled by whatever blade had sought his heart. Arya ignored him, scanning the makeshift barrier with a healer's eye, her Omega instincts overriding the rage that still simmered in her veins. The pendant at her throat thrummed, its silver crescent warming against her collarbone, as if feeding on the moon's light to pulse with her quickening heartbeat. She pressed her back to the cold wall, dagger drawn, ears straining against the wind's roar. Footsteps crunched beyond, boots, not paws, heavy with purpose. Assassins, then, sent by those who coveted the power Kaelin once wielded so ruthlessly. The irony twisted in her gut. The man who had exiled her now shared her peril, their blood trails converging like rivers to the sea. A shadow loomed at the ravine's mouth, torchlight flickering through the sleet, painting the snow in dancing oranges and blacks. "More!" a voice barked, rough as gravel, laced with the pack's northern burr. "Your king's grace runs thin. Show yourself, or we'll drag you out piece by piece." Laughter followed, cold and predatory, spears scraping stone. Arya's breath hitched, her mind flashing to Lucen Mar, the Alpha King, his silent vigil during her trial, a ghost that haunted her exile. Had he ordered this? No. Lucen's melancholy was etched in restraint, not slaughter. His eyes had held a depth that spoke of unspoken burdens, perhaps even a flicker of sorrow for her. But duty bound him, as it had Kaelin, turning men into instruments of fate's cruel hand. Kaelin shifted beside her, his hand clamping over her wrist in the dark, a grip firm yet not crushing, protective, instinctive. The touch sent a jolt through her, electric as lightning on frost, stirring the denied pull of Omega to Alpha. She yanked away, but not before feeling the tremor in his fingers, the heat of his fevered skin. "Stay down," he whispered, his body angling to shield hers, as if the gesture could atone for the chasm between them. Empathy flickered then, unbidden, in the shared silence. She saw the weight he carried, the guilt that shadowed his gaze like storm clouds over peaks. He had led the raid not from malice, but from loyalty to a lie fed by whispers in the council fires, treason pinned on her family to cover another's greed, her brother's blood on his hands. Yes, but whose poison had guided the blade? The assassins advanced, their torch flames hissing in the wind, probing the shadows. One kicked at the snow, dislodging loose stones that rattled like bones. Arya's heart pounded, a drum in the cavern's hush, each beat echoing the moral tangle within. Flee alone and let vengeance claim him, or stand as one against the night. The pendant burned hotter, its rune glowing faintly, illuminating the dried blood on her palm. Hers and his mingled in the binding cloth. What is alliance, she pondered in the breath between strikes, if not the fragile bridge over hatred's abyss? She met Kaelin's eyes in the low light, finding not the unyielding enforcer, but a man fractured by his own code, his breath sinking with hers in the confined space. A spear thrust through a gap in the barrier, scraping stone inches from her face, the iron tip gleaming with frost. Kaelin lunged, silent as a shadow, his uninjured arm snatching the weapon and yanking hard. The assassin yelped, stumbling forward, and Arya seized the moment, her dagger flashing out to slash at exposed legs, drawing a spray of blood that steamed on the cold ground. Chaos erupted. Shouts, the clash of metal, the acrid smoke of torches guttering in the sleet. Kaelin fought like a cornered wolf, his movements precise despite the wound, parrying blows that would have ended her. One attacker breached the gap, his blade arcing toward Arya's throat, but Kaelin interposed, taking the cut across his shoulder with a guttural snarl. Blood welled fresh, hot and slick, splattering her cheek, his essence marking her like a claim she hadn't sought. She countered, driving her dagger into the man's thigh, twisting until he crumpled, howling. The others faltered, dragging their wounded kin back into the storm, their retreat marked by curses and fading torchlight. Silence fell, broken only by the wind's mournful sigh and Kaelin's labored breathing. He slumped against the wall, blood pooling beneath him, his hand finding hers again. This time she didn't pull away. The touch lingered, a thread of warmth in the chill, empathy blooming into something deeper, a bond forged not in affection, but in the raw necessity of survival. His eyes searched hers, vulnerability cracking the mask. "Why stand with me?" he asked, voice a whisper roughened by pain. "After all I've wrought." Arya traced the pendant's edge, its glow dimming as the moon dipped lower, the mingled blood on her skin a symbol of their twisted union. "Because hatred alone freezes the soul," she replied, the words tasting of the Deusa's ancient truths. "And in this night we burn together." The refuge held them, fragile as new ice. As the storm raged on, their shared breaths a quiet rebellion against the fates that had torn them asunder. Yet doubt lingered in her heart. What price this alliance when Lucen's shadow loomed in her thoughts, his silent love a distant flame? The moon watched, its crimson light fading to silver promise, leaving them to the mercy of what dawn might reveal. Dawn crept into the ravine like a thief, its pale fingers prying at the shadows where Arya and Kaelin lay, entwined in uneasy truce. The storm had spent its fury overnight, leaving the world hushed under a blanket of fresh snow, pristine and unforgiving. Arya stirred first, her body aching from the cold stone and the weight of the man beside her, his fevered heat a persistent intrusion against her side. The makeshift bandage on his shoulder had crusted over, dark with dried blood that flaked away like old sins when she checked it. His breathing had steadied, deep and rhythmic, but sweat beaded his brow, glistening in the weak light filtering through the overhang. She withdrew her hand, the touch lingering on her skin like an echo, stirring the confusion that had rooted in her chest during the night's vigil. The pendant at her throat felt heavier now, its silver crescent pressing into her flesh as if demanding attention. She traced its rune with a fingertip, the metal cool despite the faint warmth it had held through the hours. Blood, hers and his, still stained her palm, a faint reddish-brown map of their shared ordeal, refusing to wash away even in the snowmelt she had used to clean her wounds. What had drawn her to bind him, to fight at his side? Not forgiveness, not yet. That was a distant shore, shrouded in mist. But in the heat of battle, as his body had shielded hers, a thread had pulled taut between them, invisible, yet insistent, woven from the Deuce's loom. Kaelin murmured in his sleep. A low rumble that vibrated through the earth, his hand twitching as if reaching for a sword long lost. Arya watched him, her silver hair falling across her face like a veil, hiding the turmoil in her eyes. 37 winters had sculpted him into a weapon, but exhaustion had stripped the edges, revealing the man beneath. Lines of weariness around his mouth, a scar tracing his jaw from some forgotten skirmish. He had spoken of rivals in the night, whispers of betrayal within the pack's ranks, ambitions that turned blades inward after the war's tide shifted against Silverfang. Yet his guilt over her exile hung unspoken, a specter in the air between them, thick as the scent of pine and iron. A distant weevo shattered the quiet, not the hunter's call, but something wilder, freer, echoing from the peaks above. Arya's heart quickened, the sound pulling at her like a summons. She rose silently, slipping from the shelter to stand at the ravine's edge, the snow crunching softly under her boots. The blood moon had yielded to a silver sliver, hanging low and serene, bathing the landscape in ethereal light. Wind whispered through the pines, carrying the crisp bite of frost and the faint, earthy promise of thaw. She closed her eyes, breathing deep, letting the cold fill her lungs until it bordered on pain. In that solitude, the pendant ignited, not with heat, but with a surge that raced through her veins like liquid fire, illuminating the darkness behind her lids. Visions unfolded, unbidden, threads of light weaving through shadow, hatred coiling like smoke only to transmute into unyielding strength, crimson fading to gold. Her gift, the Pathfinder's mark, whispered in her mother's tales, stirred from dormancy, awakened by the mingled blood and the moon's gentle coaxing. It was no mere healer's touch, it was revelation, the ability to alchemize enmity into power, to forge bonds from broken steel. Arya gasped, her hand flying to her chest as the energy pulsed outward, invisible yet tangible, brushing the world like a sigh. The snow around her feet gleamed brighter, crystals catching the light in prismatic fire, and for a moment the wind itself seemed to hush, listening. She turned back to the shelter, compelled, and found Kalen awake, propped on one elbow, his gray eyes fixed on her with an intensity that pierced the dawn's haze. He had felt it too, the shift, the awakening, like a tremor in the earth. "What sorcery is this?" he rasped, voice thick with awe and wariness, pushing himself upright despite the pull of his wounds. Blood seeped anew from the bandage, but he ignored it, rising to meet her at the threshold. The air between them crackled, charged with the residue of her manifestation, drawing him closer until mere inches separated their breaths. Arya met his gaze, unflinching, the pendant glowing faintly against her skin, its rune tracing patterns in the air like ephemeral script. "Not sorcery," she said, her voice steady, laced with the quiet authority of one who had glimpsed destiny's weave. "The Deuce's gift, the Pathfinder's fire. It burns in me, turns poison to blade." She extended her hand, palm up, the stained skin a canvas of their union. As he watched, the dried blood shimmered, hatred's residue dissolving into a warm glow that spread up her arm, knitting the edges of her own gash with threads of silver light. Pain ebbed, replaced by strength, a surge that made her stance unyielding, her eyes reflecting the moon's depth. Kalen's breath caught, recognition dawning in his storm-gray depths. He reached out, hesitant, his fingers hovering over hers before clasping her wrist, feeling the pulse of power beneath. It flowed into him, easing the fire in his wounds, staunching the blood with a mercy he had never extended. "You're the key," he whispered, the words tumbling out like a confession long buried. The prophecies spoke of an Omega who would transmute the pack's fractures, heal the rifts with lunar fire. I thought it myth, a tale to rally the weary. But you, Arya Thorn, you are the revelation that could redeem us all. Guilt shadowed his features, deepening the lines, as the weight of his past actions crashed upon him anew. He had condemned her, cast her into exile, blind to the light she carried. Now, in her presence, he saw the folly. His blade had nearly severed the thread that might save the realm from the wars devouring it. She pulled back slightly, the connection breaking with a spark that lit the snow at their feet. But the bond lingered, etched in the air like frost patterns. Empathy warred with the scar of betrayal in her heart. His perception stripped her bare, yet it affirmed her rebirth, the exile's isolation forging her into something unbreakable. Lucen's face flickered in her mind. The Alpha King's melancholy gaze, his silent love, a quiet anchor amid the chaos. Did this gift extend to him too? Or would it demand choices that rent her soul? The wind rose again, carrying the Uivo closer, a reminder that enemies, pack, rivals, shadows, still prowled the peaks. Kalen stepped forward, his hand on her shoulder now, a gesture of alliance forged in wonder. "The war turns on this," he said, voice gaining strength from the healing touch. "With your power, we could face the betrayers, mend what I've broken, but it begins with trust, mine in you and yours, in the path ahead." Arya nodded, the pendant cooling as the vision faded, leaving her with the visceral certainty of her role. Strength was no longer mere endurance. It was transformation, hatred alchemized into the fire that would light their way. Yet doubt lingered, a whisper in the wind. Could redemption claim an enemy without devouring justice? The peaks loomed, silent witnesses under the silver moon, as the first rays of sun gilded the snow, promising trials yet to come. In that fragile dawn, Arya felt the weight of destiny settle, not as chains, but as wings unfurling. Subscribe if you believe mercy can crown even the fallen. Comment Luna if you'd walk through the storm for someone who saw your... The sun clawed its way over the whispering peaks, turning the snow to molten gold that blinded like false hope. Arya stood at the ravine's threshold, the weight of Kaelin's gaze still burning on her skin, a brand of revelation she could neither embrace nor shed. The pendant hung heavy against her chest, its rune etched now with the echo of her gift, a faint scar of silver light that pulsed in time with her uncertain heart. Blood from their wounds had dried into a brittle map on her palm, hatred transmuted not to forgiveness, but to a reluctant forge, hardening her resolve as the distant Weavos sharpened into a chorus of pursuit. Kaelin rose beside her, his movements steadier now, the lunar fire having knit his flesh with threads of borrowed strength. Yet pain lingered in the set of his jaw, a reminder that healing was no erasure, only a stay against the inevitable unraveling. "We can't linger," he said, voice low and edged with the gravel of old commands. "The pack's vanguard follows the blood trail if they find us entwined like this." He trailed off, his gray eyes flicking to the peaks where shadows stirred, wolves' forms silhouetted against the dawn sky. Betrayal's scent clung to him, thick as the pine resin on the wind, his own, for the lies he had wielded like a blade, and now the rivals who turned it against him. Arya nodded, the cold air slicing through her cloak like judgment's whisper. She led the way from the overhang, boots sinking into the fresh drifts, each step a deliberate severance from the night's fragile sanctuary. The path wound upward, through a labyrinth of ice-veined boulders and stunted firs, their branches heavy with rime that shattered like brittle bones underfoot. Wind howled through the passes, carrying the metallic tang of more blood, distant but closing, and the low thunder of paws on stone. Her gift thrummed within, a quiet current urging her forward, but it offered no clarity on the moral snare tightening around her soul. To wield this power with Kaelin was to court the pack's fury, to deny it, to let the fractures widen until the realm bled out under the Deusa's indifferent moon. They crested a ridge, the world falling away in a vast expanse of white and shadow, the silver moon a fading ghost on the horizon. Below, in a sheltered valley, the pack's encampment sprawled like a wound, tents of oiled hide flapping in the gusts, cookfires sputtering against the chill, sentries pacing with spears glinting in the light. At its heart stood the Alpha King, Lucen Mar, his 40 winters carved into a frame of unyielding grace, broad shoulders draped in a cloak of midnight fur edged with frost. He turned as if sensing her approach, his deep forest eyes locking onto the ridge with the intensity that pierced the distance, a silent love, long restrained by crown and code, now shadowed by the war's cruel pivot. Kaelin's hand tensed on his sword hilt, a low growl rumbling from his chest. "Lucen," he murmured, the name laced with loyalty, fractured by doubt. "He summoned me north to root out the traitors gnawing at Silverfang's flanks. But the whispers, they point to his own counsel, ambitions festering like rot." The words hung between them, heavy as the gathering clouds, stirring the embers of Arya's old ache. Lucen had watched her trial in silence, his melancholy a veil over the bond she had felt even then. Omega to king, a pull deeper than instinct, resisted by the hierarchies that bound them. Now, reborn in exile's fire, she wondered if that love could bridge the chasm, or if it demanded she choose, the enemy at her side, or the king who had failed to save her. The Uivos crested the ridge behind them, a pack of enforcers bursting from the tree line, 10 strong furred cloaks whipping like banners of vengeance, eyes gleaming with the hunt's feral gleam. Their leader, a rival alpha named Thorn, no kin to her, but a name that twisted like a thorn in her gut, bared his teeth in a snarl, his blade drawn and bloodied from some prior clash. More, the blade turned dull, he bellowed, voice echoing off the stones. "The king calls for your head, and the traitors whelp beside you. Silverfang purges its poisons." He charged, his wolves fanning out, the air filling with the clash of steel and the hot spray of breath on frost. Arya's heart thundered, the pendant igniting as chaos descended. Kaelin met the first blow, his sword singing through the air in an arc of desperate precision, parrying Thorn's strike with a force that sent sparks flying like lunar embers. Blood welled from a shallow cut on his arm, but he pressed on, shielding her flank as she drew her dagger, the gift surging through her veins like molten silver. She dodged a lunging enforcer, her blade finding his thigh in a twist that dropped him howling into the snow, crimson blooming against white. The wind screamed, whipping snow into veils that blurred friend from foe, the valley below a distant roar of the pack rousing to the fray. Thorn circled, his eyes narrowing on Arya with predatory calculation. "The exiled Omega, risen like a weed. Your blood taints us all, treason's seed." He lunged, but Kaelin interposed, taking the blade's edge across his ribs in a spray of red that steamed on the cold ground. Arya cried out, the sound raw and unbidden, her hand pressing to the wound as her gift flared. Hatred's coil unwinding into strength, knitting flesh with threads of light that glowed ethereal in the daylight. Kaelin staggered, but stood, his gaze meeting hers in a moment of shared fire, guilt and gratitude warring in his depths. From the valley, Lucen ascended the slope, his presence parting the melee like a storm's eye. His wolves halted at his command, a single raised hand silencing the clash. Up close, his face was a map of restrained torment, eyes tracing Arya's form with a hunger veiled in sorrow. "Enough," he rumbled, voice deep as ancient roots, carrying the weight of unspoken pleas. "Kaelin, my blade, you stand with her, and you, Arya, exile's daughter, what flame have you kindled in the wilds?" Thorn snarled defiance, but Lucan's glare quelled him, the rival's ambition checked by the king's unyielding authority. Arya stepped forward, breath ragged, the mingled blood on her hands, hers, Kaelin's, the fallen, a testament to the judgment unfolding. Lucen's nearness stirred the bond, a warmth that clashed with the chill of betrayal, his love a quiet anchor pulling at her core. Yet Kaelin's wound pulsed under her touch, his redemption a fragile thread in her grasp. "The past confronts us here," she said, voice steady amid the wind's wail, the pendant's glow illuminating the moral precipice. "Treason festers not in blood, but in silence. I can transmute it, hatred to strength, but the choice is yours. War's chains, or mercy's uncertain path. Forgiveness for the blade that broke me, or freedom stained by vengeance." Lucan reached for her, his fingers brushing her cheek, the touch electric as moonlight on snow, evoking the love that had simmered in shadows. Kaelin watched, torn between duty and the debt he owed her life. Thorn's pack circled, tension coiling like a spring, the air thick with the scent of blood and pine, the distant moon a silent arbiter. What is justice? Arya pondered in the heartbeat of standoff, if not the mercy to rebuild what power destroys. The peaks held their breath, the confrontation a forge where alliances would shatter or endure, her heart the anvil upon which destiny hammered its verdict. The ridge trembled under the weight of unspoken verdicts, the wind carving furrows in the snow like the scars of choices yet unmade. Arya's breath fogged the air, each exhale a fragile mist that dissolved into the vast, indifferent sky, where the silver moon lingered like a half-forgotten promise. Lucen's touch on her cheek burned, not with the fire of her gift, but with the quiet ache of what might have been. A love restrained by thrones and silences, now laid bare in the harsh light of dawn. His forest-deep eyes held hers, shadowed by the crown's burden, pleading without words for the redemption only she could forge. Yet Kaelin's blood still slicked her fingers, warm and insistent. A tether to the enemy who had become her unlikely shield, his gray gaze fractured by the debt he could never repay. Thorn's enforcers shifted, their boots grinding ice into powder, the metallic rasp of drawn blades underscoring the tension that coiled tighter than a noose. The rival Alpha sneered, his lips curling over fangs stained with the hunt's residue. Ambition, gleaming in his yellowed eyes like torchlight on tainted gold. Mercy? From an exile's whelp? He spat the words into the wind, his voice a venomous curl that stirred the pack's murmurs below, a tide of suspicion rising from the valley's encampment. Lucen's hand dropped from Arya's face, his posture straightening into the unyielding line of kingship. But the sorrow in his stance betrayed him, the melancholy of a ruler who had loved in shadows, only to watch her fall to the very justice he commanded. Kaelin stepped forward, his wounded frame casting a long shadow across the snow, blood seeping anew from the gash Arya's gift had barely sealed. Pain etched his features, deepening the lines of guilt that had haunted him since the night he led the raid on her kin, but his voice rang clear, laced with the gravel of resolve. The poison festers in you, Thorn, not in her blood. He gestured to Arya, his hand steady despite the tremor, positioning himself between her and the encroaching circle of wolves. The air thickened with the scent of pine sap and fresh spilled crimson, the pendant at her throat pulsing in rhythm with the escalating howls from the valley, as if the Deusa herself stirred the threads of fate. Thorn lunged, his blade a silver blur aimed at Arya's heart, the strike born of calculated spite to shatter the fragile alliance before it could bloom. Time fractured in that instant, the world narrowing to the arc of steel and the hot rush of wind. Kaelin moved without thought, his body interposing like a wall of flesh and bone, the rival's sword biting deep into his side with a wet, tearing sound that echoed in Arya's soul. Blood sprayed, a profound red against the white expanse, steaming as it hit the frost, mingling with the drifts in patterns that evoked ancient runes, sacrifice etched in the earth's cold canvas. Kaelin staggered, his growl a guttural denial of defeat, but he twisted, driving his own blade into Thorn's shoulder, forcing the Alpha back with a roar of agony. The enforcers surged, a whirlwind of fur and fury, but Lucen's command thundered across the ridge, halting them mid-stride. "Stand down!" His voice carried the weight of the peaks themselves, deep and resonant, quelling the chaos as his personal guard crested the slope, their armor glinting like armored stars under the climbing sun. Thorn retreated, clutching his wound, his eyes promising retribution as he melted into the shadows of his wolves, the pack fracturing under the king's glare. Yet the damage lingered. Kaelin collapsed to his knees, breath ragged and wet, his hand pressed to the fresh gash, blood pooling beneath him in a dark mirror that reflected the moon's fading silver. Arya dropped beside him, her knees sinking into the snow, the chill seeping through her like doubt's insidious creep. Her gift ignited unbidden, a lunar fire surging from her core, threads of silver light weaving from her palms to his torn flesh. Hatred's remnants, his betrayal, her exile, transmuted in the blaze, hatred coiling into unyielding strength, knitting muscle and sinew with a warmth that bordered on divine agony. Kaelin's eyes met hers, storm-gray depths brimming with unspoken absolution, the guilt that had marked him dissolving like mist before the sun. "For what I took," he rasped, his voice fading as the healing claimed him. "I give this. Live, Arya. Redeem what I could not." She felt the power ebb, leaving her drained yet reborn, the pendant cooling against her skin as if sated by the ritual. Lucen knelt opposite her, his hand covering hers on Kaelin's shoulder, the three of them bound in a tableau of blood and breath, the wind whispering philosophies of mercy through the pines. His touch reignited the old bond, a quiet flame that had smoldered through her trials, now free to burn without the chains of hierarchy. Love, not as reward, but as proof, bloomed in that shared silence, his melancholy yielding to the hope she carried, the Omega's gentle current tempering the king's storm. Kalen slumped back, stabilized but spent, his chest rising in shallow affirmation of life. The valley below hushed, the pack watching from afar, their uivos silenced by the spectacle of unity forged in sacrifice. Arya rose, pulling Lucan with her, their fingers entwined, the mingled blood on her skin a symbol of the cure she had wrought, not erasure of justice, but its evolution. Redemption included her enemy. His risk a bridge over the abyss, allowing love to return untainted, a union that honored the scars rather than hiding them. Yet the peaks loomed, promising greater trials, the Deuce's gaze a reminder that rebirth demanded vigilance, compassion's fire ever at war with vengeance's shadow. In that gilded dawn, Arya felt the weight lift, her heart sinking with Lucan's steady pulse, the moon's silver a benediction on their path. Strength was choosing mercy amid the ruins, and in his eyes she saw the realm's future reflected, not as conquest, but as healing, the first fragile step toward wholeness. If your heart beat alongside ours, like, comment, and subscribe. Because every soul that joins our moon keeps the flame of redemption alive. The sun crested the whispering peaks like a crown of molten iron, gilding the bloodied snow in hues of reluctant mercy, as if the Deusa herself deigned to witness the forge of fates. Arya stood between the two men who had defined her unraveling and rebirth, the wind weaving through their shared breaths like threads of an unfinished tapestry. Kalen's form lay propped against a frost-rimed boulder, his chest rising in shallow defiance of the wound that had nearly claimed him, the silver light of her gift lingering on his skin like veins of moonlight etched in flesh. Lucan's hand remained clasped in hers, warm and unyielding, his forest-deep eyes reflecting the quiet storm of love long silenced by duty, now freed to claim its proof in the ruins of betrayal. The valley below stirred, the pack's murmurs rising like a tide against jagged shores, Silverfang's fractured heart, torn between old loyalties and the spectacle unfolding on the ridge. Thorn's enforcers had scattered into the pines, their retreat a bitter echo of ambitions thwarted, but the air hummed with the scent of unrest. Pine sap sharp as suspicion, blood's coppery warmth fading into the chill, and the faint, acrid smoke of dying cook fires drifting upward like unanswered prayers. Arya's pendant pulsed against her throat, its crescent rune a steady heartbeat, drawing strength from the moon's hidden gaze, now veiled by daylight, yet ever present in her veins. The mingled blood on her palms, hers, Kalen's, the fallen, had dried into a sacred sigil, hatred transmuted not to oblivion, but to the unyielding alloy of justice and compassion. She knelt once more beside Kalen, her free hand tracing the edge of his wound, where flesh knit with ethereal threads, each pull a visceral tug on her own soul. Pain radiated through her, a deep ache that mirrored the exile's scar, but it was laced with power, the Pathfinder's fire, burning brighter in sacrifice's crucible. His gray eyes fluttered open, meeting hers with a clarity unclouded by fever, the guilt that had shadowed him dissolving into quiet acceptance. "It ends as it began," he murmured, voice rough as gravel under boot, his fingers brushing hers in a gesture stripped of command, only gratitude. "With blood on the snow, but yours. It redeems what mine stained." The words hung between them, heavy as the peaks, a confession that bridged the chasm of his blade's old decree. He had risked all, not for absolution, but to prove that even enemies could choose mercy's edge over vengeance's abyss. Lucan watched, his grip tightening on her hand, the melancholy of his crown yielding to the raw vulnerability of the man beneath. 40 winters had forged him into a king of silences, his love for her a hidden flame tended through trials he could not voice, bound by the code that had allowed her fall. Now, In the ridge's unforgiving light, he knelt fully, his midnight cloak pooling like spilled night around them, drawing her close until their foreheads touched, breaths mingling in the wind's hush. "Aria," he whispered, the name a prayer etched in deep timbre, evoking the unspoken bond that had pulled at her even in exile's depths, an Omega's gentle current to his alpha storm, resisted yet inevitable. "You've walked the wilds alone, carrying the weight I failed to lift. Let me share it now, not as king, but as the one who sees your light." Her heart clenched, the pendant warming as if the moon approved, its silver glow tracing faint patterns across their joined hands. The gift surged again, unbidden, flowing from her core to envelop them both, Kaelin's wounds sealing with a final shimmer, Lucen's hidden scars of leadership easing in subtle warmth. Hatred's remnants coiled and burned away, transmuting into strength that bound without erasing. Justice for her brother's blood, not in slaughter, but in the rebirth of a pack renewed. She pulled back slightly, eyes tracing Lucen's face, the noble lines softened by hope, his love no reward, but the proof of choices endured. Redemption included Kaelin, his sacrifice a cornerstone, allowing her to return Lucen's affection whole, untainted by the demand to forget. Love was the trial they had all survived, emerging not unscathed, but forged stronger, the Deuce's weave revealing destiny as freedom claimed, not imposed. Kaelin rose unsteadily, supported by Lucen's steady arm, the three forming a triad against the wind's probing fingers. The pack crested the slope below, their forms a sea of fur and steel, Weavos fading to wary silence as they beheld the union. No words passed. The air itself spoke, thick with the philosophy of renewal. What is rebirth, if not the mercy to heal what power shattered? Aria stepped forward, her voice rising clear and resonant, carrying over the peaks like a lunar call. The fractures end here. Treason dies in silence no longer. We choose compassion's blade over war's endless hunger. The words rippled outward, stirring the crowd, some kneeling in awe, others murmuring assent, the rival shadows retreating further into the wilds, quelled by the evident shift. Lucan drew her into his embrace then, his lips brushing her temple in a kiss that tasted of pine and promise, the bond sealing with a visceral warmth that chased the cold from her bones. Kaelin stood sentinel beside them, his presence a quiet vow of loyalty redeemed, the blood moon's legacy now silver light in their shared path. The sun climbed higher, melting the snow's edges into rivulets that carved new paths down the mountains, symbolic of the realm's healing, slow, painful, but inevitable. Aria felt the weight lift fully, her spirit unfurling like wings in the updraft, the Pathfinder's fire a steady ember within, ready for the trials ahead. Exile had stripped her bare, but in this union, she was reborn, not as victim or savior, but as the heart that mended kings and enemies alike, love's proof enduring under the Deuce's watchful eye. The peaks sighed in the wind's caress, the world vast and waiting as Aria Thorn claimed her destiny, not in isolation, but entwined with those who had tested her soul, the flame of redemption burning eternal. If your heart beat alongside ours, like, comment, and subscribe, because every soul that joins our moon keeps the flame of redemption alive.